The battlefield stretched as far as the eye could see, a graveyard of metal and flesh under the cold light of distant stars. Smoke curled upward from craters, mingling with the acrid scent of burning fuel and scorched earth. The ground was littered with the remnants of war, shattered weapons, the tattered banners of once proud empires, and the lifeless bodies of soldiers who had fought and fallen. In the center of this desolation lay a lone figure, Zycarian, the warrior king of the Chthonies, a race known for their unyielding strength and martial supremacy. He was a towering figure. Even in his broken state, his obsidian armor cracked and smeared with blood, his own and that of others. His once proud crest, a symbol of Chthoni's dominance, hung limp, torn and soiled. Around him, the eerie silence of betrayal echoed louder than the sounds of the fading battle. Zycarian's breathing was labored, each inhale a ragged gasp as pain raked through his body. His enemies had been ruthless, but it was not their blades that had undone him. No, it was the treachery of those he had called allies. In the decisive moment, when unity was paramount, the coalition of alien races he had led had turned their backs, retreating into the void and leaving him to face the enemy's wrath alone. Their fear of his power, their envy of his dominion, had outweighed their loyalty. He clenched his fists, the sharp edges of his armor biting into his palms. The Chthonies did not beg, and they did not falter. If this was the end, he would meet it with honor. But even as his resolve hardened, his vision blurred, and the weight of his injuries pulled him closer to unconsciousness. A low hum pierced the quiet. Zycarian's eyes flickered open, his instinctive wariness overpowering his exhaustion. A small ship descended, its sleek form bearing none of the ornate designs favored by the more advanced races. This was something simpler, something human. The vessel landed cautiously, its landing gear stirring dust and ash. The hatch opened, and a group of humans stepped out, their movements hesitant as they surveyed the carnage. At their head was a woman with cropped brown hair and piercing gray eyes. Her uniform bore no insignia of power, but her presence commanded respect. She gestured for her team to spread out, her gaze settling on the fallen king. "Captain, over here," one of her crew called. They had found Zycarian, sprawled against the remains of a shattered artillery turret. The Chthoni's warriors stared at them, his golden eyes dim but still burning with defiance. The captain approached, her expression unreadable as she crouched beside him. "Zycarian," she said, her voice steady. She didn't need to ask who he was. His reputation preceded him. The humans knew him as a conqueror, a warrior unmatched, and a ruler who had never looked twice at their kind. Yet here he was, reduced to a shadow of his former self. He managed a weak snarl, his pride refusing to yield even now. "You dared approach me? You're not in a position to make threats," she replied calmly, though there was no malice in her tone. "We're not here to harm you." One of the crew, a young man with nervous energy, muttered, "Captain, he's Chthoni's. They'd kill us without a second thought if the roles were reversed." "That may be true," she said, not taking her eyes off Zycarian. "But we're not them, and I won't leave anyone to die, even him." Zycarian laughed, a sound that was more a cough than mirth. "Humans always meddling in matters beyond you." His voice was rough, but there was a flicker of something beneath the derision. Curiosity, perhaps, or disbelief. "Maybe," the captain said, rising to her feet. "But meddling is what keeps us alive." She turned to her team. "Get him on board." Carefully, there was hesitation, murmurs of dissent, but none dared openly challenge her. Two of the stronger crew members stepped forward, their expressions grim as they maneuvered Zycarian onto a stretcher. He was too weak to resist, though his eyes never left the captain, studying her with a mix of suspicion and reluctant respect. As they carried him aboard, Zycarian's mind raced. Why would humans, the weakest and most insignificant of the galaxy's races, risk themselves for him? He had no illusions about his standing. His people viewed humanity as little more than an evolutionary footnote, tolerated but irrelevant. Yet here they were, showing him a compassion he had never afforded them. The ship's interior was cramped and utilitarian, its walls adorned with patches and jury-rigged systems that spoke of resourcefulness born from necessity. They laid Zicarian into med bay, where a medic began assessing his injuries. The equipment was primitive by Chthoni's standards, but the humans worked with a quiet determination that defied their reputation. As the captain stood nearby, arms crossed, one of her crew spoke up. "Captain Hart, you're risking all of us for him. If the Chthoni's find out—" "They won't," she interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "And if they do, we'll deal with it. We're not leaving him to rot." Zicarian watched her, his gaze heavy with something he couldn't yet name. It wasn't gratitude. His pride wouldn't allow that, but there was a grudging acknowledgement that these humans, for all their flaws, possessed a strength he hadn't expected. The ship shuddered as it lifted off, leaving the desolation of the battlefield behind. Zicarian closed his eyes, his body succumbing to the pull of exhaustion. As darkness claimed him, one thought lingered in his mind. Humanity was more than he had ever given them credit for, and they had just saved a king who would never have done the same for them. The hum of the ship's engines reverberated through the metallic walls, a steady reminder of their fragile sanctuary among the stars. Zicarian awoke to the faint beeping of medical monitors and the muffled voices of the human crew. His body ached, every movement a reminder of his injuries and the humiliation of his rescue. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the human captain seated nearby, her gaze fixed on a datapad. "You should have left me," he said, his voice low but laced with the sharp edge of disdain. Elena Hart looked up, her gray eyes calm and unreadable. "Good morning to you, too," she replied dryly, setting the datapad aside. "You're welcome, by the way." Zicarian shifted, trying to sit up, but the restraints of pain and exhaustion held him down. "Your meddling delays the inevitable. My people will not thank you for this. They would sooner see you destroyed than acknowledge any debt." "That's not why we did it," she said, her tone even. "We don't save people because we expect gratitude. We save people because it's the right thing to do." The Chthoni's warrior's golden eyes narrowed. "Naivety will be your downfall, human. The galaxy does not reward mercy. And yet," she said, leaning forward slightly, "here you are alive because of it." Their conversation was interrupted by the ship's comms crackling to life. "Captain, we've got a problem," came the voice of the pilot. "Unidentified vessels closing in fast, 2, maybe 3. They're armed." Elena stood, her expression hardening. "Acknowledged. Prep for evasive maneuvers." She glanced back at Zicarian. "Stay here. Rest." He laughed bitterly. "You're being hunted because of me. I warned you." "Maybe," she said as she headed for the bridge. "But we're not done yet." The ship jolted as enemy fire grazed its shields. On the bridge, the crew worked with practiced urgency, their hands flying over controls as alarms blared. The pursuing ships were sleek and predatory, their dark hulls marked with the sigils of rival Chthoni's factions. Elena recognized the designs immediately. Mercenaries, likely sent by those who had betrayed Zicarian. "They're hailing us," said the communications officer. "Put it through," Elena ordered. The screen flickered to life, revealing the grim face of a Chthoni's commander. His silver crest shimmered under the dim light of his warship, and his voice was cold as he spoke. "Humans, you carry what belongs to us. Surrender the traitor Zicarian, and we may yet spare your insignificant lives." Elena's jaw tightened. "He's not yours to take." The commander's expression darkened, his lips curling into a sneer. "You dare defy us? Do you truly think your flimsy vessel can withstand Chthoni's firepower?" "We'll manage," Elena said, cutting the transmission. She turned to her crew. "Bring shields to full strength and prepare for combat maneuvers. Let's show them what humans are made of." Zicarian entered the bridge, his imposing figure seeming to fill the cramped space. Despite his injuries, he stood tall, his presence commanding attention. "You cannot fight them and win," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. Elena didn't flinch. "We're not in the habit of surrendering." He studied her for a long moment, then let out a low growl of frustration. "Your ship is slow, and your weapons are pitiful compared to theirs. But you are resourceful. that might yet save you. Suggestions? She asked, not missing the glint of reluctant respect in his eyes. Bait them into the asteroid field, Zycarian said, pointing to a section of the star map. Their ships are larger and less maneuverable. If you keep them distracted, I can disable one of their targeting systems. Elena hesitated, the idea of handing over control to the same man who had called her species insignificant gnawing at her. But the urgency of the situation left little room for pride. Do it, she said, stepping aside to let him access the controls. As the human vessel dove into the asteroid field, the Chthoni's ships followed, their heavy weaponry struggling to lock onto their nimble target. Zycarian worked quickly, his fingers moving with precision over the console. Elena watched him out of the corner of her eye, marveling at the transformation in his demeanor. Here was a man who had lost everything, yet his confidence and skill remained unshaken. The ship shuddered violently as an asteroid grazed its hull. "We're running out of room," the pilot called. "Hold steady," Zycarian commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He activated a burst of electronic interference, scrambling the targeting systems of one of the pursuing ships. Its weapons misfired, striking a nearby asteroid and triggering a chain reaction of explosions. The shockwave sent the remaining enemies scattering, giving the human ship a narrow window to escape. Course plotted, the pilot announced as they cleared the field. "We're out of their range." Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to Zycarian. "Not bad for someone who thought we couldn't win." He smirked faintly, his pride tempered by the smallest hint of admiration. "You are reckless, Captain, but effective." Back in the med bay, as the adrenaline subsided, Zycarian found himself grappling with a new and uncomfortable feeling. The humans had risked their lives for him, not out of obligation, but because of a principle he had dismissed as weakness. Their actions had not only saved him, but also forced him to confront his own prejudices. Elena joined him, leaning against the doorway. "You don't owe us anything," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "But if you want to survive, you'll have to trust us." He regarded her silently for a moment before nodding, a small but significant gesture. "Trust is earned, human, but you may yet succeed where others have failed." The ship sailed on through the quiet expanse of space, its crew united by a shared purpose. For the first time in his life, Zycarian felt the faint stirrings of something unfamiliar, a sense of belonging among those he had once considered beneath him. The final confrontation was upon them sooner than anyone had expected. The human ship, battered but resilient, drifted through the outer reaches of the neutral zone, where the Chthoni's and their allies had established a tense, uneasy truce. Zycarian stood at the ship's viewport, his eyes scanning the horizon where warships loomed, their gleaming hulls marking the entrance to a battle neither side wanted, but one that would soon become unavoidable. Elena entered the bridge, her steps measured, though the weight of the situation hung heavy in the air. She caught sight of Zycarian, his imposing silhouette framed by the stars. "We've reached the coordinates. I can see them out there." Zycarian's gaze never left the enemy fleet. His people, once proud and unstoppable, now stood fractured, divided between those who had betrayed him and those who remained loyal. He had come to accept that the battle for his survival was not just against these enemies in space, but within the heart of his own race. But in this moment, it was not his past allegiances that mattered. It was the humans, the ones who had saved him, who would shape the outcome of this fight. "They think they can still control me," he said, his voice low and steady. "But they do not understand the power of a people who are willing to fight for their survival, no matter the cost." Elena didn't speak, her expression grim. She understood what he meant. The fate of the humans had always been precarious in a galaxy that saw them as weak, irrelevant. But that had never stopped them from pushing forward. "What's the plan?" she asked. Zycarian turned to face her, his golden eyes gleaming with an intensity that she had come to recognize. He was not the proud king who had once looked down on humans, but a warrior now bound by an uneasy alliance. "We will not face them head-on. If we're to survive, we must show them we're not an easy target." He moved to the command console and began issuing orders to the crew, his voice a calm but commanding presence. The human ship, while not a match for the Chthoni's warships in terms of firepower, was agile, its size offering an advantage in the field. They would use that to their benefit. As the crew prepared, Zycarian stood beside Elena, his demeanor almost serene. "I will not ask you to follow me into this fight, human. I am no longer a king, but I owe you my life, and I will fight beside you, if you will have me." Elena met his gaze, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. There was none. In that moment, the divide between their races seemed small, insignificant. "We fight together," she said firmly. The first wave of Chthoni's ships loomed large on the view screen, their weapons charging, ready to fire. The captain's hands tightened on the console. "Brace for impact," she called, as the ship veered sharply to the left, narrowly avoiding a barrage of plasma bolts. The crew worked in perfect synchrony, their movements fast and precise. Zycarian, despite his injuries, was a force to be reckoned with. He moved through the ship with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding and fighting. He took his position at the weapons station, his hands flying over the controls as if the ship itself were an extension of his will. He had never trusted humans, never believed they could be more than a footnote in the history of the galaxy, but the sight of them fighting with such determination stirred something in him. A pride, a loyalty that he had never expected to find. The battle raged on, the human ship weaving through the Chthoni's fleet, expertly dodging incoming fire and taking every opportunity to strike back. Zycarian's tactical genius was evident as he guided them through narrow gaps in the enemy's formation, exploiting every weakness. But the odds were still stacked against them. Then, as the human ship executed a particularly daring maneuver, a burst of enemy fire struck its starboard side, tearing through the hull and sending sparks flying. The ship lurched, and alarms blared. The crew's focus never wavered, but Elena's jaw tightened as she gripped the helm. "Status? Shields are down to 20%, the engineer reported, but we're still functional. "We need to end this now," Elena said, her voice low but determined. "Zycarian, we can't keep running." He nodded, his face a mask of concentration. "We won't. Trust me." The final move was audacious, even by Zycarian standards. They would bait the enemy into thinking they had the upper hand, drawing them in with feigned weakness. Then, at the last possible moment, they would turn and strike. Zycarian took a deep breath, focusing his thoughts. The enemy ships, unaware of the trap, closed in, ready to deliver a fatal blow. Elena gripped the ship's control, her knuckles white, as she guided them toward the center of the formation. "Now!" Zycarian barked. With a swift motion, the human ship spun around, unleashing its remaining firepower into the closest Chthoni's vessel. The sheer unexpectedness of the attack caused confusion within the enemy ranks, and in the chaos, they were left vulnerable. The human ship's small size and speed allowed it to dart between the larger ships, delivering precise strikes at the most critical points. The enemy fleet faltered. Ships began to break formation, their targets shifting, their coordination unraveling. Zycarian's plan had worked. As the battle drew to a close, the remaining Chthoni's vessels retreated, leaving the human ship victorious but battered. The crew, though exhausted, exchanged relieved glances. They had done it. Against all odds, they had survived. Elena looked at Zycarian, her face a mixture of exhaustion and respect. "You were right. We couldn't have done it without you." Zycarian's expression softened, though his pride remained intact. "No, you did not need me to win. You needed only your will to fight." The words carried weight, recognition of the strength that had once been dismissed as weakness. In that moment, the divide between their two races seemed less insurmountable. Zycarian, the once mighty king, had learned something he had never believed possible, that the true strength of a warrior was not just in their might, but in their willingness to stand with those who would fight for what they believed in, no matter the cost. The human ship sailed on, its crew united by their shared victory and the knowledge that their future, once uncertain, was now theirs to shape. Zycarian, for the first time, felt the stirrings of a new path ahead, one that perhaps included humans after all.